I've been feeling sick for the past lately. You can tell because I let my facial hair grow out. Anyways, I thought I would do something quick and simple, so let's respond to more comments. First up, Christianity is not about feeling better about life. I'd like to stop right there and explain. In the video that he's commenting on, a preacher said that he is not an atheist because from an atheistic perspective, there is no hope, meaning, purpose. I forget what exactly he said. And I responded by saying that I don't need any intrinsic hope, meaning, or purpose, and I'm not going to believe in fairy tales just because it gives me that sense of purpose or hope. I'm not going to believe religion just because it makes me feel good. That is not to say that the only reason people are religious is to feel good. Although I did say, and do still believe, that religion can be a coping mechanism, there are various reasons why people become religious or are religious. It is so that we can live a better life, as free as possible from sin, and so that we know what the truth is, and to spread the good word so that more people can be saved. Okay, when you say better life, that's according to who? According to God? I assume so, because you coupled it with being as free as possible from sin. That sounds to me not like you're trying to embetter yourself as much as you are trying to appease a God who demands it from you. Now, even though I'm an atheist, I very well can take steps to become what I consider to be a better person, to live what I consider to be a better, more peaceful life. As an atheist, you can still have a sense of morality, right and wrong, and what makes a person a good person, and you can still strive to be that. You don't need a God to tell you how to be a good person, and so that you know what the truth is. But that's interesting because I first need to find out that religion is true in order for me to accept that it is the truth. That's kind of the point of what I do here. I don't see any indication that religion is true, so why am I going to turn to a religion to try to find out the truth? You're only saying this because you're already religious. You are already convinced that it is true, but I need to be convinced that it is true. And I'm only convinced in a rational way. Living your life as an atheist means you will commit sin knowing that it is wrong, because God gave us a conscience that tells us what is right and wrong. Well, by your definition of sin, yes, I do sin, but that's because your definition of sin is kind of impossible to avoid. But here's the thing, I don't actually think that it is wrong, not simply because I want to do it, but because I don't see what makes it wrong. In my mind, something being wrong is if something is harmful. I'm not going to do anything that seems to be more harmful than is necessary, because I believe that to be immoral. That's what I live by. And I don't see as lusting after another person to be significantly harmful to anyone in any way. And you say that God gives us a conscience, which is pretty interesting. Consider the conscience differs from person to person, and especially from culture to culture. Why is that? Is different things right or wrong depending on the person and the culture? It seems like our conscience is greatly influenced by our society and our feelings. So it's not set in stone by any means. And if God is the one who gave us our conscience, then I'm not sure that I can trust that, considering how shaky God's own conscience is, because he regretted several things, including making us and sending an angel to destroy Jerusalem, which he changed his mind about. And it's also interesting because according to my conscience, which apparently God gave me, it is wrong not only to own a slave, but it's even worse to beat a slave. But that's perfectly fine according to the Bible. In fact, Jesus himself said that some slaves should be beaten more than others. And in the Old Testament, God said that you can beat a slave as hard as you want as long as he doesn't die in a couple days. Not to mention the racism in the Bible, which explicitly states that the Hebrew race is superior to all other races, and that was used to justify genocides and even infanticides. It's interesting to me that God gave me a conscience to make me think of how horrible he really is when I look at him from an unbiased perspective. And an indication that God exists is to feel the Spirit. You know you are feeling it when you are worshiping the good God in heaven. Okay, so you're saying that if I am convinced enough that God exists to worship him, then I will be convinced that God exists. Okay, I've said it before. Personal experience is not reliable information. You can't draw reliable conclusions based on how good you feel. The religious experience that you're talking about, that has been experienced not only among so many different sects of Christianity, which all differ from each other, but even across religions. Believe it or not, Muslims feel this exact same way, as do Buddhists, Hindus, and especially the New Age movements and that sort of thing. If I wanted to experience a sort of euphoric, altered state of consciousness, then I would go and buy some drugs. It's an easier way of doing it. Next up, from the same guy, God puts people in hell because every one is a sinner, and people have to be met with justice. Okay, I can understand that, except for the part where people are sinners. Because who defines what is sin? Is it God? And who decides what the punishment is for sinning? Is it God? So God just decides when to punish us and for what reason. How are we to know that those reasons are just? Because God told us so? Because God told us that He's just? In God's eyes, we broke His law of the 10 Commandments. Okay, let me stop you right there. In no way was the 10 Commandments the full extent of the law. It was a small part of it that was given to Moses. And the full law includes stuff like not wearing clothes, which is a mixture of 2 different types of fabric. That would be violating Jewish or Old Testament law. And that's a sin? Why? See, our morality isn't based on that, nor is that really based on our morality, at least not as of today and in this culture. Instead, that was a rather primitive system of government. I'm not going to base my consciousness and what I do on a primitive system of government. And Jesus' death is a payment of the price that we would have to pay for violating His laws. How so? According to the Bible, the price that we pay is an eternity of burning in hell. But Jesus paid that in 3 days? An eternity for 3 days. An eternity for billions of people paid for 3 days of one person. And people are still debating as to whether or not Jesus actually went to hell. But this is the price that God set for the punishment that God set for doing what God set was wrong. Again, we don't know that this is just. It seems to me like it totally isn't. God knows things as right and wrong in an understanding way beyond ours. And there it is. God knows more than we do. And we know that because God told us so. Why does the Bible tell you to smash children against rocks for fun? Well, God's morality is kind of just higher than us. We don't really understand it. How do we know that? God told us so. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Any reasonable person would know there is no material proof of God that can be ascertained. That is precisely why it is called faith. Well, I'm glad that this guy is honest and understands what religious people mean when they say faith, instead of switching back and forth between the 2 definitions, whichever one suits them properly. For many, their faith of God is established on the first principle that God must remain unseen. They postulate that if there were proof, then not believing in God would not be free will, while others establish it as a principle for the allowance of grace. The absence of data does not allow one to assert either way. It must be made noetically with the hope that their reasoning is right. Therefore, each party must go forward in their faith that God does or does not exist, while respecting others who believe differently. No. If we have no indication that something exists, is it more reasonable to assume that it does exist, or to assume that it doesn't? Or is it more reasonable to withhold judgment and not say either way it does or does not exist? I stand in the camp of God probably does not exist. And part of my reasoning for that is I see no indication. You can't say, I see no indication, so I'm going to believe in him anyways. Would it be reasonable for me to assume the existence of an invisible pink unicorn, or the existence of a teapot that is orbiting the sun between us and Mars? I have no indication whether or not those things exist, so I might as well just assume that they do, right? No, it's unreasonable. I have no indication that it exists, so it probably doesn't. Whatever is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. That's what I'm doing. Next up, faith is the answer to your question. No, it's not, because that's unreasonable, whereas my question was reasonable. Next one, you're even more of a wiki, parroting, pretender clown, moron than shtick. This is gonna be good. Allow me to demonstrate. ... A. Define, then identify the parts of a formal scientific hypothesis. ... Question mark. Okay, that was not a question in any way, and in no way is the ellipses necessary. That's just making it really hard to read. Thank you for that. Hypotheses don't necessarily have parts of them. They're just statements, any old statement, as long as it is a testable statement. That's really all a hypothesis is. B. Post the Lucy formal scientific hypothesis. ... Question mark. Again, that's not a question. Do you understand how punctuation works? Anyways, Lucy herself is not part of a hypothesis, but instead she's part of the test. The hypothesis is that human bipedalism evolved from apes, but separately from other modern extant apes. And Lucy very well does indicate that that is the case, showing both primitive ape-like features and more modern human-like features. Not that humans aren't apes. C. Dovetail the parts of the Lucy formal scientific hypothesis with the parts of the real formal scientific hypothesis you established in A... ... Question mark. Again, there's no parts of a scientific hypothesis. It's really just a statement that can be tested and that you intend to test. The statement is that human bipedalism evolved within apes, but separately from other modern apes. That's a very good scientific hypothesis that can be and certainly was tested and validated even. D. What is the goal of scientific hypothesis formulation? I.e., what is a scientific hypothesis attempting to elucidate? The goal of a hypothesis is to make an educated guess, which is to be tested, and this is part of a process. And the goal of the scientific process is to learn more about what we can in a streamlined way to find what is most likely to be true. So the goal of a hypothesis is to make a statement that you wish to validate, and that potentially will be validated. E. What is the goal of every single scientific inquiry? I sort of answered that already. So that's all the comments I have for today, but I do have an exciting announcement. I am now selling merch. That's right, you can now buy t-shirts. I have 3 styles. One, which I don't happen to have, is simply my logo. But up next is this one, which sort of implies that you're me. And next up is this one, my personal favorite. All of which are the same price. They come in men's and women's shirts, and don't worry, they do come in colors other than white. So if you know that you want one of these shirts, now is the time to buy them, since I'm opening the shop today, or maybe yesterday, depending on how I can work things out. Then for the next 2 weeks, everything will be 15% off using this code. So if you already know that you want one of these shirts, now is a pretty good time to buy them. Links are in the description, but regardless, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.